That's one of my favorite jazz guitar licks of all time. As far as licks go, which I don't rely on a ton, I've probably played that more than anything else. I learned it maybe 25 years ago. It is from the exact introduction of Grant Green's guitar solo on the tune On Green Dolphin Street, which is a standard jazz tune. And this is from the album that Grant Green played with a piano player named Sonny Clark. This is one of my favorite jazz guitar albums of all time. I have many favorite jazz guitar albums, so in this video, I thought I would share many of them with you. I'm going to go through 13 of my favorite jazz guitar albums of all time, and forgive me for calling this video the best jazz guitar albums of all time. If you want to soak in some jazz into your brain and listen to some amazing, historically significant, world-class jazz guitar players, then I highly recommend checking out these 13 albums. At the end of the video, I will give some advice on how to approach listening to challenging music. Jazz can be rather challenging to listen to at times, and it requires that we kind of develop a taste for it and an appreciation for it. So I'll tell a little story about some experiences I had with listening to challenging music and a recommendation and advice for how to approach listening to jazz if you are not already a fan and not already comfortable with listening to it a lot. Okay, so here are my 13 best jazz guitar albums of all time. They are in no particular order. I highly recommend all 13 of them. Here's the first one. First up is the album I was just talking about. This is Grant Green, The Complete Quartets with Sonny Clark. Grant Green was an amazing guitar player and had such a unique sound. He had kind of this heavy sound, playing with thick strings and having kind of like funk and blues attitude in his playing. You can hear him digging in. This is in the 60s where he was very active on the kind of the Blue Note record label era of jazz, and this is what we can call the hard bop era of jazz. And there's a lot of just awesome attitude in his playing. So a highly recommended guitar player to listen to, and this album is fantastic. I've never done this before. Let's see how it goes. I'm going to play a little snippet from the album. This is that spot where that lick happens at the beginning of his solo. I'll just play it maybe 5 seconds. I don't want to get the video taken down, so I'll play little snippets, maybe a few seconds of some of these albums. And on and on and on it goes. Grant Green was known for having a lot of sustainability with his playing, that he could just play all night on and on without sounding stale, without sounding like he was repeating himself. That's so I hear from the stories about him. So great guitarist to listen to. Let's go on to album number 2. The next album is Pat Metheny's Bright Size Life. If you're interested in jazz guitar at all, you've probably heard of Pat Metheny. This is the album that put him on the map. All his playing is great. I'm a big fan of his playing and his artistry and his innovations. But this early album is just so innovative on its own, and it's kind of a groundbreaking album in having a new sound, and you can just hear kind of the fresh energy of Pat Metheny and his virtuosity and in his youth. And he plays with Jaco Pastorius as the bass player, who also was an incredibly innovative and groundbreaking bass player. So this is a fusion album, and it is just absolutely incredible. One thing that Pat Metheny did was he incorporated triads into his harmony, which that's, what we think of as basic chords for popular music and folk songs and stuff like that. But in jazz, it's actually, once you get used to the language of jazz, it's kind of weird and difficult to play over triads. It's actually harder because we get so used to all of these colorful, play anything you want over all these extensions kinds of chords. And Pat Metheny incorporating kind of a more poppy, open sound into his harmony was kind of one of his trademarks and something innovative that he did. And in Bright Size Life, you can definitely hear that. Let's play a tiny moment from it. Oh, it's so good. That's such a Pat Metheny sound. Those kind of little slides into nothingness, that is his sound. It's awesome. It's very relaxed. And then that lick that we heard, it's kind of a very basic, very straightforward kind of lick that just fits harmony here with A7. Leading to D, but he does it in this poppy way. where he adds this other note and then resolves with a half step. It's beautiful. And that's the beginning. Then he goes into his solo from there. So Bright Size Life is the next album. Highly recommend it. Let's go on to the next one. Number 3 on the list is Incredible Jazz Guitar. This is Wes Montgomery. I've talked about Wes Montgomery on the channel before. Check out my videos on playing octaves, octave techniques, and check out my video on D Natural Blues, which is on this album. It's D Natural Blues is the name of the tune, and it's just a D Natural Blues progression, and it's an original melody that Wes Montgomery wrote over it. Wes Montgomery is the guitarist you'd hear people name drop if they're talking about jazz guitar very often, because he was one of the most influential jazz guitarists of all time, innovating many techniques, playing with octaves, playing a round, kind of robust sound, playing exclusively with his thumb, and just an absolute virtuoso, an incredibly melodic player. So this, honestly, you take any Wes Montgomery album and it's going to be great. Incredible Jazz Guitar is one of my favorite. There's Wes Montgomery Trio albums. There's Boss Guitar is a great one, but this is the one on the list that I would like to recommend to you. Let's play a little snippet from it. This is... It's the beginning of his solo for D Natural Blues, which is just a fantastic solo. That little moment there, straight up the diminished scale. I did a video all about the diminished scale, the theory of it, how it's used, how to use it musically. And so, example of it in someone's solo right there. Incredible Jazz Guitar by Wes Montgomery. Amazing album. Let's move on to the next one. The next album is Undercurrent. This is a Bill Evans album from 1962. Bill Evans is just an amazingly tasteful and virtuosic piano player. This is the piano player that played with Miles Davis on the album Kind of Blue, kind of has his famous moment in So What, where he plays a certain chord structure on that song that everybody recognizes. If you want to hear more about that, check out my quartal chords video on quartal structure chords, and I talk about the song So What and Bill Evans' chord structure in that. Anyway, why is it on this list? It's because this is a duo album with Bill Evans and Jim Hall. Jim Hall, probably if I could only listen to one guitar player, and this will change moment by moment, day to day, I might just choose Jim Hall though. Jim Hall is so kind of reserved compared to a lot of guitar players. He's not going for flashiness as much as he's going for tastefulness and harmony and being as melodic as possible. And on this album, you can hear them and feel them listening to each other. And we hear about jazz being this art form that is all about listening and interactivity and improvisation, where you are working together as a unit with other people, listening, which is one of the hardest things to do. We need to learn how to play so comfortably that we can have mental space to then listen to other people that we are playing with. This is something we all need to work on a lot. Well, in this album, if you listen to it and listen for how much they are interacting with each other, it is phenomenal. So here's a little moment from it. Out of context, it's probably hard to appreciate the way that one could. If you put headphones on, listen to this before bed. That was Darn That Dream, a ballad on this album. You can hear Jim Hall making those internal harmonic moving lines and them just being so in the spot, in the sweet spot with each other. So absolutely beautiful. This album I just listen to on loop sometimes all day. So highly recommended. That's Undercurrent, Bill Evans' album, and that is with Jim Hall. Probably there's not a list of the best jazz guitar albums of all time that doesn't include Joe Pass. Joe Pass is a remarkable virtuosic guitar player who was known for his solo guitar playing, where he's just playing by himself, nobody backing him up, and just mind-blowing guitar playing, sometimes quite frenetic. And my favorite of his playing is when he seems to be a little more kind of relaxed and softer in his playing. And this album of his is my favorite, Meditation. It's incredible to listen to this album and acknowledge that it was live. It was a live performance. This is just a set where he walked out on stage and played the guitar by himself, and it's beautiful. So one of the tunes is All the Things You Are. Let's listen to the very beginning of that. Just that alone is so cool, because that tune is arranged as a solo guitar arrangement so often because it kind of lends itself to that. But when you listen to him doing that, he has all these internal harmonic movements that he's improvising, and it just shows his level of understanding of the tune and the harmony and everything. We'll play a tiny bit of that again and then hear him go into a lick. And that's just him playing the melody, right? He's improvising around it and adding fills and just incorporating everything. He's still in the melody of the tune. So this whole album is amazing. This is one of the ones I recommend, Meditation by Joe Pass. Next up, I think we're on number 6 now. This is Kurt Rosenwinkel. So let's get out of the traditional kind of old heyday of jazz and move into the more modern people who are playing jazz guitar today. And Kurt Rosenwinkel is one of the most prolific improvisers in jazz guitar who's living today and has a unique sound, has a voice. This album is from 2009. This is my favorite album of his. This is Standard's trio Reflections. The first song on the album is called Reflections, and it's also the song that we'll hear a little snippet of that I recommend. You can hear the originality in this album and the personality and just how it's a much more modern sound. We have actual guitar effects pedals being used, or I don't know if he's using pedals, but he has a guitar effects, and just, post kind of traditional jazz and post even kind of fusion jazz, you can hear how this sounds a little more relevant and informed by more recent music when you listen to this album and when you listen to Kurt Rosenwinkel. What I love about Kurt Rosenwinkel's playing is kind of his angular melodic sound, and I hear a lot of kind of very interesting kind of harmonic and scale patterns that he has under his fingers that he uses, so not really super typical melodies, but still very much harmonically pleasant at the same time. And I find that really stimulating when listening to it. Let's check this out for a sec. Just a little moment in the first track called Reflections. So that's a little arrangement part of the tune. You can hear him using chord melody, but you can hear that tone and that timbre and the effects that are in there and just kind of the modern voice. And that was very much a kind of a melodic arranged section, and you can hear his harmonic language in there that is not super traditional. It's not like a standard tune kind of harmonic language. It's beautiful. Next up is Adam Rogers. I love this album, but it took me several listens. I had to sit with it for a while. At first, I was very surprised when I first listened to this album. I was like, what is going on here? He has also a very unique sound, and it's almost robotic seeming at first, that he's just so kind of in the pocket with time, and he plays very fast and very precise and very clean and very scalar. And at first, it's just so different than kind of jazz licks that you think of. And at first I didn't know what to think of it, and then I just fell in love with it. And I just love how linear and ongoing it is. So let's listen to a second. It's kind of like, it's a certain taste where it's, especially this sample here is very kind of fast jazz playing, but I kind of just like letting it wash over me. Let's listen to this for a second. So just obviously clean, warm sound, and virtuosic and fast, and also light and smooth and slick, and a lot of chromatic notes to kind of connect everything together. But this whole album is really cool. I heard somewhere, I don't know if this is true, I haven't looked, fact checked it, but I heard that Adam Rogers was one of John Mayer's guitar teachers somewhere. So yeah, I should have checked that before the video, but fun little fact if that's true. This album was released only a couple years before the Kurt Rosenwinkel album that we just heard, and similarly clearly you can hear that it is informed a little bit by more modern music and, fusion, and there's some effects involved in just the production value of it and the more experimental lines at times. So it has this modern, kind of more recent jazz texture to it, which is quite enjoyable to listen to. So we're not just only ever listening to kind of the heyday of jazz as people think of jazz, like swing and bebop and cool jazz and hard bop or even fusion. It's nice to listen to players that are alive today and hear them try to continue the art form along, try to have a voice and stand out and do something different and experiment and stretch their creativity. So I like listening to the whole range of musicians throughout the history. And we'll have some even more recent stuff coming up soon. Let's move on to the next album. So speaking of jazz that is of the distant past and then jazz that is of the more kind of relevant, modern, current times, Mike Stern, I kind of think of as right in the middle. This album, the Standards and Other Songs by Mike Stern, is from the 90s, but Mike Stern as a young player played with Miles Davis. And at the time, Miles Davis was the most innovative, revolutionary jazz musician of his time. I mean, he changed the face of jazz 5 times over. And Mike Stern played with him in one of his bands and then went on to be kind of a superstar of fusion jazz guitar in his own right. This album where he's playing jazz standards is my favorite because my taste is a little more in jazz harmony than it is in fusion, but he has a lot of albums that are more rocky, more funky, more kind of poppy, but just a great player. And this album shows how knowledgeable he is about jazz harmony and chromatics and actual jazz lines. It's just incredible. This sample here is Moment's Notice. Let's just listen to the beginning. So kind of an improvisatory intro to this tune, and he's so light and fluid and fast playing, and then he also has these effects on his guitar. He has delay, which is really contributing to that wash of sound. You can still hear all his articulations, but then he has delay and some chorus effect on it as well, which is very much his signature sound. But you can just hear his absolute knowledge and vocabulary, having transcribed a bunch of other jazz musicians and got it into his playing and whatnot. A lot of these players, to play so smooth and light and fast and slick like that, are using slurs, hammer-ons, and pull-offs in very specific places while they're playing. I just did a video recently about doing descending scale runs with slurs, that is pull-offs, while playing down a scale in a very specific spot to get that smooth, light kind of connection in our playing. To begin working with that, check that video out if you want. There's a link in the description. Next up, we have Julian Lage. Julian Lage is very much of the moment in jazz guitar, releasing albums regularly, just released new music. As of right now, when I'm recording this, it's 2023. He just released an album. This album we're talking about here is from last year, 2022. And so Julian Lage is on the forefront of contributing to jazz guitar right now. And he comes across as just a humble student of the craft in a beautiful way, and exploring his voice in various ways throughout different albums, not ever sticking to exactly the same sound, different tones, different approaches. He has a solo guitar album. He has various bands he put together. This album has Bill Frisell playing with him as a side player, and it's not a Julian Lage and Bill Frisell album. It's just Julian Lage, and Bill Frisell is just hanging out playing with him, and it's just one of my favorite albums of his and of all time in terms of jazz guitar. I saw him play live recently, and it was such a treat. And I actually took a lesson from Julian Lage long time ago. I don't know if he would remember me, but he was touring through town. I saw him at a small jazz club, asked him for a lesson, and he said yes. And I met up with him the next day, and we did a lesson at his friend's house who lived in Seattle here. And it was very formative for me. It was really amazing. I'll talk more about that another time, and maybe I'll even try to get him on the channel at some point and do an interview with him. Let's listen to a little moment from the tune Tributary on this album, the first track on this album called View with a Room, Julian Lage. And right away, just the tone, the timbre, the production value. This is what makes it feel like a current album, and it's just an amazing sound. Just a tasty moment there. And, just that beat, that drum beat is totally like, you would never hear that in, the heyday of jazz or the hard bop era, 60s or whatever. It's just like playing to that beat. And so the way that the sound and the art form has changed over time is very cool to track and to absorb amongst all the various sounds that we can get in the history of jazz. Let's move on to the next album. Next up is Kenny Burrell. This is an album with John Coltrane, just called Kenny Burrell and John Coltrane. Kenny Burrell is a very straight-ahead jazz player that's very bluesy, depending on what song or album you're listening to him on. This album more jazzy than bluesy, and it's a great exposure to John Coltrane as well. So duo playing just guitar and saxophone with John Coltrane. Let's hear a snippet of this. And this is from 1963. So this is a year after the Bill Evans, Jim Hall. And you can hear it being from that same era. So let's hear this for a second. Listen to Kenny Burrell playing the chords underneath John Coltrane. Just beautiful harmony, voicings, a little bit of kind of movement, interactivity, chord melody in there, and just mastery to know enough to be that interactive and jump around to different voicings and make it melodic at the same time while accompanying someone and listening to them. Beautiful stuff. Django Reinhardt, the legend, a virtuosic gypsy jazz guitar player who famously had a hand injury in a fire accident where two of his fingers became unusable, and he plays everything with two fingers. And he's this story that's told over and over again about what's possible if you refuse to believe that your limitations will hold you back. Django Reinhardt changed the face of guitar, and he only had two fingers. Beyond that, the music is quite inspired and tasteful. And as far as albums go, this is music that was released in originally the 30s. So my favorite album is just Best of Collections. And this is the one I recommend, just called The Best of Django Reinhardt. The little sample I have for you, my favorite tune on this album is I'll See You in My Dreams. Let's listen to a little bit of him improvising over the tune, I'll See You in My Dreams. Oh, so good, so melodic. And actually, back to Julian Lage for a second. In that lesson that I took from Julian Lage, one of the main things he told me was, listen to Django Reinhardt. Listen to Django Reinhardt and transcribe what he's playing and learn it and study it. And he really was one of his main points. And so I left, okay, I gotta go listen to Django Reinhardt, gotta learn what he's playing. So Django Reinhardt, Best of Django Reinhardt is the collection that I like, but you kind of can't go wrong if you just go check out some of his playing. We're almost done here. This is number 12. This is Pat Martino. The album that I recommend is Footprints. Pat Martino is a unique voice in jazz guitar, also has a very interesting personal story where he got amnesia, forgot how to play, and relearned how to play and relearned how to sound like himself. Very interesting story. This album really highlights his playing that he was known for. Really flashy, really fast, really quick jazz lines that just completely nail the harmony and include chromatics. Let's just listen to a little bit of his improvisation, just a little moment from it on the tune How Insensitive. Beautiful tune. That's a bossa nova tune. That's a jazz standard, or a bossa nova standard at least. Let's listen to Pat Martino on this tune just for a minute. A second, really. That's very much Pat Martino. It is just so clean and just following the harmony exactly. Just beautiful playing. And that's a tune that track, How Insensitive, on this album from Pat Martino, I will just put on loop, just listen to over and over and over again. Just absolutely beautiful. So Footprints, Pat Martino, that's number 12. Let's do the last one. I saved a very unique and special guitar player for the last album here, Lenny Breau. And this album, Cabin Fever, is also very unique, even among his work. Lenny Breau is different than the typical jazz guitar player because he's influenced by so much more, and jazz is probably what he's known for, but he was a child prodigy finger-picking guitar player in the country style of Chet Atkins, even played and was kind of mentored by Chet Atkins, and then got into classical guitar and flamenco guitar and jazz. And in a lot of his playing, you can explicitly hear these influences, not just kind of influences, but he just switches into different styles. And he's just a very, very unique solo guitar player with totally his own style to accompany himself. I mean, sometimes it's just hard to believe that he's playing melody and then comping for himself underneath, making those two things sound completely separate. He really devised his own kind of system and style to do that. So Lenny Breau's sound on this album in particular is kind of tragic and troubled sounding. The story behind this is that he was locked himself in a cabin to go cold turkey to get off of heroin. And this album is just a recorder that he had where he's recording himself warming up and practicing and playing. So it's not at all a studio album. It's not studio quality or anything, but it's this fly on the wall experience to hear him just noodle and just play and definitely play through tunes. There's real tunes in it, but also he just kind of plays around like one would when they are just sitting around playing guitar or practicing. So very special, very strange kind of album, and it's definitely on my list of important jazz guitar albums. Let's listen to a moment, but it's hard to kind of find a moment that we can listen to 5 seconds of and have it be impactful because you have to take this in as an experience that's kind of bigger. But let's see what we do with a little needle drop here. I hear him switching into a new feel, and he's a master of solo guitar in totally his own way. Not like a Joe Pass style, but filling in the harmony, the bass, melody, and everything. And he's using nails on a nylon string guitar. Totally unique. That was from You Came to Me Out of Nowhere, the tune, track 4 on this album. So if you want to soak in these jazz guitar players, just put all these albums on a playlist, put it on shuffle, or listen through in order and just get it into your soul. And if you find any of it challenging, and if jazz is hard to sustain listening to, or just you find difficult to follow, what I recommend is simply more exposure. Just exposure, 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 and reserve judgment until you feel like you have absorbed a good amount of it and listened intently to a good amount of it to appreciate the texture, appreciate kind of the sentiment and art form that is happening in jazz. When I was in school, I took an ethnomusicology class, and the first assignment that we had was to listen to this field recording of a folk guitar player that was poor quality recording. The singing was not, perfectly executed. The guitar was slightly out of tune. And the instructor put this music on for the whole class and said, "What do you think of this?" And every single person was like, "Oh, why is it out of tune? Why is it it's an amateur recording, da 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 da." And our homework assignment was to listen to that recording 10 times. You had to listen to it like purposeful, focused listening 10 times. And then we came back, and the question again, the discussion was, "Now, what do you think of this? Be honest, what do you think of this?" And every single person had their mind changed, saying, "Wow, this recording is heavy, this is deep, this is moving, this is powerful, and I absolutely love this recording," after having listened to it 10 times. So the exposure, the brain is trying to work out what we're listening to and what we're exposed to. And no doubt jazz is challenging and confusing at times and dense and complex. And so the more exposure, the better. So the brain can start to become familiar with some of the motions and movements and dialect and vernacular that are happening in this style of music, which is such a wonderful, rich tradition. If you're interested in playing jazz guitar and you don't have my Any Jazz Chord booklet, then definitely get that booklet. You can download it for free. There's a link in the description, or you can go to soundguitarlessons.com/anyjazzchord. It's a little method book that shows how we can play any jazz harmony any harmony, anything from any of those albums, those recordings, anything from the real book or a collection of jazz tunes or a lead sheet with 8 chord shapes. Sounds silly because I'm talking about how rich and complex jazz is, but it's really true that with 8 chord shapes, we can play an accurate version of any jazz chord that comes up in any of these tunes. So you'll have to check it out to see what I mean. And I have a video all about that too. So if you want to watch something next, I'll recommend that video that walks through exactly how that method works. I'll put a link to that video on the screen here if you're watching on YouTube, or you can go to the link in the description. I post a new lesson video every week. Next week's video, I am beginning a jazz chord melody series called Make It a Chord Melody. We're going to take a bunch of tunes and turn them into chord melodies and talk about the formula and language of how to do that. It's going to be really fun. I'm looking forward to it. Hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. Take care and happy practicing.